My name is Clara Whitmore, and the first thing my parents said to me at the will reading was, "Go earn your own." I was sitting across a long mahogany table in a downtown law office, the kind of place where the air smelled like paper and polished brass. My sister, Madeline, was beaming, holding a cashier's check for $10 million the lawyer had just handed her. My mother's lipstick-perfect smile lingered on Madeline a beat too long before she turned to me, her eyes cool and expectant. My father leaned back in his chair like he'd just finished a job well done. The words hung there between us, casual, almost bored, like they weren't slicing through years of what they'd already taken from me. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I traced the grain of the table with my fingertips, pretending my pulse wasn't pounding in my ears. Outside the window, the city moved on as if nothing had shifted. Inside, something had. That's when Mr. Richard Cole, my grandfather's lawyer, cleared his throat. He reached into his briefcase, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a worn envelope. My grandfather's handwriting, sharp, deliberate, impossible to mistake, sprawled across the front. The moment I saw it, my mother's smile faltered. My father's jaw tightened. Madeline's knuckles whitened around her check. "There is one more document," Richard said, his voice steady but weighted. I leaned forward without meaning to. I hadn't seen that handwriting in 3 years. Not since they made sure I couldn't. The envelope rested in Richard's hand like it carried more than paper. It carried the one thing my family had spent years trying to erase, and in less than 5 minutes, it was going to be read aloud in front of all of them. The drive to my grandmother's house felt longer than I remembered. I'd been there 1,000 times as a kid, sitting in the back seat of my grandfather's old pickup with the windows rolled down and the smell of salt marsh drifting in from the coast. But that day, the road felt strange, like I was heading toward something I'd been avoiding without even realizing it. The oak trees still arched over the 2-lane road, their branches draped in Spanish moss, but instead of comfort, they felt like watchful eyes. When I pulled up to the weathered white house at the end of the gravel drive, the front porch swing swayed lazily in the late afternoon breeze. It was the same swing my grandfather used to sit on after dinner, sipping sweet tea while I told him about whatever experiment I was working on for school. I hadn't seen the house in nearly 3 years. The wooden steps groaned under my feet as I climbed them, and I half expected no one to answer the door. But the knob turned before I could knock. "So, you finally decided to show up?" My grandmother's voice was as sharp as I remembered, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same tight bun, her eyes as steady as ever. But there was something in them now, a hardness I didn't remember. She didn't step forward to hug me. "Grandma," I said, searching her face for warmth, for relief, for anything that might soften her words. She crossed her arms. "They told me you were too busy, that you didn't want to be bothered, that you'd moved on to a new life." Her words hit harder than I expected, because I knew exactly who they were. "That's not true," I said quickly. "I tried to call. I came by in March. Madeline was here. She said no one was home." Her eyes narrowed. "We were here. We were always here." A silence stretched between us, heavy and uneven. Then she turned and disappeared into the dim hallway. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The smell hit me first, lemons and furniture polish, with the faintest trace of my grandfather's pipe tobacco still lingering in the air. The living room looked exactly the same. The floral sofa, the crocheted afghan draped over the armrest, the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. When she came back, she was holding a worn leather notepad. She set it down on the coffee table and tapped the cover. "This is the number he kept calling," she said. I recognized the handwriting instantly. My grandfather's. Blocky. Neat. With a slight slant to the right. I opened the notepad and saw the phone number written in bold, dark ink. It wasn't mine. Not even close. My stomach dropped. "Grandma. This isn't my number. I've had the same one since college." Her brow furrowed as she stared at the page. "They told us you changed it. That you didn't want to be tracked down. That you were ashamed of us." I felt the blood drain from my face. "No. They lied to you. They cut me off from you on purpose." Her hands trembled, but she didn't look away from me. She sank slowly into the armchair by the fireplace, her knees seeming to give out. "They told me the funeral was at noon," I said quietly. I got to the church, and it was empty. Her eyes lifted to mine. "The funeral was at 9, she said, her voice low. "They told everyone you didn't show, that you didn't care." I pressed my hand to my mouth. I would never have missed his funeral. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with things we both should have said years ago. The clock ticked louder. Outside, the wind rustled the magnolia leaves against the porch railing. Finally, she stood. Her movements were slow but deliberate. There was fire in her eyes now, the same fire I'd seen when she defended my grandfather's land from developers who wanted to pave over the marsh. "I'm calling them," she said. "Calling who?" I asked. She didn't answer. She walked to the kitchen, where the old rotary phone still hung on the wall. My grandfather had refused to replace it with a cordless model. I stood in the doorway and watched her dial each number with care. The clicking of the rotary was like a drumbeat, steady and certain. When the line connected, her voice went cold. "Betty, I need you. Jacob and Madeline here. Now." There was a pause, a muffled voice on the other end. "No, it can't wait." She cut in sharply. "Be here in an hour." She hung up without saying goodbye. Then she turned to me. "The lawyer's on his way, too. Your grandfather left some instructions to be read only with everyone present, and that's exactly what we're going to do." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I just nodded. For the next hour. I sat at the small kitchen table, tracing my finger along the worn grooves in the wood. I remembered sitting there as a child, watching my grandfather read scientific journals I mailed him from school. I remembered him asking about my high school science project like it was as important as any research paper he'd ever read. The air felt different now, thicker, like the walls were holding their breath. Footsteps crunched on the porch. The doorbell rang. My grandmother placed a hand on my shoulder. "Stay here. I'll call you when it's time." From the kitchen, I could hear their voices as they entered one by one. "Oh my goodness, it smells exactly the same in here," my mother said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "I thought this was handled already." My father's calm, flat voice followed. "Seriously? This couldn't have waited until after the estate is processed?" Madeline sighed loudly. Then, silence. And my grandmother's voice, colder than I had ever heard it. "Please sit down. Mr. Cole is on his way. He'll be reading Walter's final instructions." I pictured their faces in my mind. Confused. Maybe even annoyed. They had no idea I was here. And they had no idea what was about to come. When the front door opened again, I heard a new voice. "This won't take long," Richard said. "But it must be done properly." My grandmother's voice carried through the hall. "Clara, come in now." I stood. My pulse hammered in my throat as I stepped into the living room. 3 heads turned toward me. My mother's smile froze. My father's jaw clenched. Madeline's eyes went wide. The air snapped like static. They weren't just surprised to see me. They were terrified. Richard Cole set his briefcase on the coffee table like a judge placing a gavel. No one spoke. The grandfather clock ticked, steady and indifferent. The way time is when a family is about to split down the middle. My mother recovered first. "Mother, this is unnecessary," she said, smoothing the front of her blazer. "We already held the reading downtown. Everything has been—" "Be quiet, Betty," my grandmother said, without looking at her. My father cleared his throat. "Margaret, let's not make a scene." "You made the scene," she replied. "I'm just turning on the lights." Richard unlaced the leather straps on his case and lifted out a thick manila envelope and a thinner, older one whose edges were softened by handling. He placed them side by side. The older one had my grandfather's handwriting across the flap, decisive, spare. The way he wrote purchase orders and birthday notes. Walter S. Whitmore. Supplemental instructions. "Per Mr. Whitmore's directive," Richard said. "These documents are to be read in this room, with the family present, and only after the formal will is executed. The supplemental instructions do not alter the will, but they do clarify intent and the disposition of certain non-probate assets." He glanced at my grandmother, then at me. He was very specific. My mother shifted. "Richard, you and I have known each other 20 years. Surely we don't need theatrics." Richard's face didn't change. "Then this should be simple." He opened the larger envelope first. Papers slid out in a tidy stack. He took the top sheet and read, "Voice. Even. Addendum A. Upon my death, I direct that Harrow Research Annex, located at 41 Live Oak Road, and all associated equipment, accounts, patents, and intellectual property be transferred to my granddaughter, Clara Whitmore." Madeline made a sound I'd only ever heard from her in dance recitals when she missed a turn. Sharp, thin, disbelief wrapped in embarrassment. "What?" My father leaned forward. "This is absurd. That facility belongs in the main estate." "No," Richard said. "It doesn't. Mr. Whitmore titled the annex in a separate holding company 3 years ago. It's not part of the residuary. The transfer triggers on death pursuant to a beneficiary deed filed with the county. We registered it the week after he signed." My mother's eyes flicked to my grandmother. "Mother, you let him do this?" "I didn't let him do anything," she said. "He told me what he planned. I agreed with him." Madeline stood, then sat again, when she realized no one would stand with her. "Granddad barely saw Clara for years. Why would he give her? Why would he give her that?" Richard turned a page. Addendum B. Annual operating funds for the annex shall be drawn for 3 years from the Whitmore Charitable Trust under Budget Code 7132. The trustee shall have discretion to extend for a 4th year upon evidence of program efficacy. He looked up. "Your grandfather set aside an endowment to keep the doors open while the work finds its legs." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I felt it leave me. Heat rushed to my eyes. I blinked it back. "This is ridiculous," my father said. Louder now. The way people get when they hear a verdict they don't like. "Clara doesn't run labs. What does she even do? Margaret? She writes proposals. She consults. She's never managed a facility." "I learned to manage because you never did," my grandmother said. "No one is attacking anyone." Richard cut in, gentle but firm. "We're honoring instructions. That's all." He set the addenda down and picked up the thinner envelope. He slid a letter out. Single page. Lined. Written in a hand that made my chest tighten. "To be read aloud," he said. My mother exhaled sharply. "This is manipulation from the grave." My grandmother's voice hardened. Leave if you can't listen. My father put a hand on my mother's wrist. For once, she didn't shake him off. Richard began. To my Clara, if this is being read, I am where you can't follow yet. He paused as if hearing my grandfather's breath. But you were always good at finding paths no one else saw. The room shrank to the size of his words. The clock, the porch, the creak of the old floor under Richard's shoes. All of it faded. I watched you count the time between lightning and thunder when you were 8. Richard read. How you held your breath whenever the sky spoke, then grinned when your math matched the world. Your mother said you were dramatic. I said you were an observer. The world needs observers more than performers. Madeline's head dropped. She stared at her hands. I know you think I forgot you. The letter continued. I didn't. I called a number that wasn't yours and asked a voice that wasn't you to come by. I waited by the porch light. I believed lies because they were offered with a smile I taught my daughter to use. My mother flinched. I can't fix what I didn't see soon enough. The letter went on. But I can do what I should have done earlier. Give you a room no one else can lock. The annex is yours. Not a prize. A tool? Not a debt owed. A bet placed. My throat burned. You were never a consolation prize. Clara, you were the point. You wrote your own role when the script didn't have a line for you. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it out loud. Make things. Break things. Teach children to love failure until it turns into discovery. When the work hurts, take your grandmother's coffee with 2 sugars and sit on the back steps until the marsh teaches you patience again. Richard swallowed, blinked once, and finished. And if they tell you you're too much or not enough, remember that neither is a measurement built for you. I loved you without spectacle. I hope this letter is enough of one. Walter. The letter went quiet in Richard's hands. No one moved. My grandmother's eyes were wet, but her mouth was set. She looked like a woman who'd finally put down a heavy box she'd carried too long. My mother spoke first, soft and small. A voice I barely recognized. He thought I smiled like that because of him? She stared at nothing. I learned to smile because my father wouldn't look at me unless my teeth were perfect. The room tilted. For a second I saw a girl inside my mother, standing on her toes to be seen. Then she blinked, and the steel slid back into place. This is still unfair, she said. It makes Clara the hero in a story she didn't write. I didn't write it, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. I just stopped letting you erase my lines. Madeline's chin trembled. He promised me. She stopped. Tried again. You both promised me if I visited every week, if I read to him, if I stayed, it would all come to me. She turned to my father, then my mother. You said being dependable mattered more than whatever Clara is. My father looked tired, older. We said what we thought would keep the peace. Peace for whom? My grandmother asked. Silence again. Richard cleared his throat, delicate as a clink of china. There is one final item, he said, and pulled a smaller document from the addenda stack. A letter to me, instructional. He unfolded it. Richard, if they bully Clara, call the bank. Move the endowment to a donor-advised account under Margaret's authority. If they threaten court, tell them we don't fight where there's no war. If they cry, give them tissues. If they deny, give them receipts. My grandmother made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Richard looked up. He kept receipts. My mother's face flushed. This is humiliation. No, my grandmother said. This is a ledger. Madeline stood again, hands shaking. So what now? We just Clap for Clara? Pretend this isn't favoritism dressed up as legacy? No, I said. I stood too. Slow. So the chair didn't scrape. The old wood still sighed. We don't clap. We work. I won't fight you in court. I won't sign away anything either. The annex is mine to steward. You can dislike it. You can tell your friends I tricked a dying man. But I'm done living at the mercy of your version of me. My father rubbed his temples like he wanted to erase the day with his thumb and forefinger. We're not villains, Clara. You don't have to be, I said. You just have to stop pretending you didn't build the house on a lie. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Madeline's eyes flicked to the letter in Richard's hand and then to me. I expected hatred. What I saw was confusion, and under it, something like grief. Richard slid the pages back into their envelopes. He placed the letter to me on the table, closer to my side than theirs. Per Mr. Whitmore's request, the original is to remain with the family matriarch. He looked to my grandmother. Margaret? She reached out, and for a moment her hand hovered in midair, as if the paper were heavier than it looked. Then she took it and tucked it inside the cardigan at her chest like a talisman. That's enough, she said, rising carefully. We're done. My mother straightened. We will be speaking to council. You already did, my grandmother replied. For years. Madeline stared at the floorboards. I don't want to fight, she said, barely audible. I just don't want to be invisible. Something in me uncoiled. I remembered her as a child, all elbows and certainty, hogging the camcorder during Christmas and narrating every moment like the world would end if she didn't. I'd resented it. I'd resented her. I can't fix what you didn't get from them, I said, careful with the words like they were glass. But the annex will host a summer program this year. If you want to help kids tell their stories, to present, to communicate data, you can come. We could use someone who understands an audience. Her head snapped up. She blinked. You'd let me? I'd let you work, I said. The rest is up to you. My mother scoffed. Bribery? How noble? No, my grandmother said. An invitation. Try it sometime. My father stood, smoothing his tie like he was about to leave a meeting and head to another where he'd be more comfortable. We should go. For once, my grandmother said. We agree. They filed toward the door. At the threshold, my mother turned back, eyes glossy, anger and something raw vying for space. You'll regret this, she said. Not a threat. Exactly. More like a hope she'd mistaken for prophecy her entire life. I've regretted enough, I answered. The latch clicked behind them. The house breathed. Richard gathered his things and looked at me. He was proud of you, he said. He said it the last time I saw him. I nodded because I couldn't speak. He touched the brim of a hat he wasn't wearing, an old habit. Maybe. Then left as quietly as he'd come. For a long minute, my grandmother and I stood in the center of the room, each listening to the other breathe. She moved first, crossing the worn rug to the window that faced the magnolias, then turning back to me with a look that made me feel 8 and unbreakable again. Coffee? She asked. With 2 sugars, I said. In the pantry? She said, half smile returning. Where he hid it so I wouldn't see how much he used. I laughed, and the sound surprised me. In the kitchen, the kettle took its time, the way kettles do in houses that refuse to hurry. I found the sugar tin exactly where she'd said, behind the bag of self-rising flour. The stove flame hissed blue. We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. When the kettle whistled, she took it off the heat and handed me the heavy mug my grandfather always used, the one with a chipped rim and a faded lighthouse. I wrapped my hands around it and felt the warmth climb into my arms. What now? She said. I looked toward the back door, toward the marsh, toward a road that would carry me to a building with my name newly written on its deed. I thought of tables waiting for papers, of microscopes wrapped in plastic, of children who would walk through a door and see a room where failure wasn't a verdict but a method. "Now," I said, "we go unlock a place no one can lock again." She nodded, satisfied, and somewhere between the kettle's fading whistle and the clock's tireless tick, I understood that today hadn't given me a victory. It had given me a beginning. The first time I saw Harrow Research Annex, it didn't look like a laboratory at all. From the road, it could have been an old carriage house, tucked away behind a hedgerow and a weathered gate, with red brick walls and arched windows that caught the morning light. But when I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the air changed. The space smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil, the way my grandfather's workshop used to when I was a child. Sunlight spilled through skylights onto wide workbenches lined with covered microscopes, unopened cartons of lab glassware, and computer terminals still wrapped in shipping plastic. And in the center, like some private welcome, was a small table with a single object on it. My old field journal from middle school, the one I thought had been lost years ago. Its green cloth cover was frayed at the edges, the corners softened from being carried in my backpack everywhere I went. I ran my hand over the cover, feeling the indent of my name, pressed into the fabric in my own childish handwriting. Inside were the same sketches: bee-wing anatomy, soil pH charts, cloud formations, and my awkward but determined notes in pencil. I had to sit down. My knees didn't quite trust me to stand while I took it in. My grandfather hadn't just built me a lab. He had built me a home for my mind, a place no one could bar me from. No one could shrink me inside of. The first months at the annex were equal parts exhilaration and exhaustion. I worked with 2 grad students I trusted from my university program, Noah and Tasha. We applied for small grants, designed low-cost irrigation trials for rural farms, and tested new compost formulas. The work was messy, sometimes thankless. There were weeks when we lost whole sample batches to contamination or when a funding lead dried up overnight. But it was ours. And for the first time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder for permission to exist here. By the end of our first year, we'd started the Young Innovators program, Saturday workshops for high school students from surrounding counties, kids who'd never held a microscope before or tested a hypothesis outside a textbook. We gave each of them a small bound notebook, modeled after mine, with the words my grandfather had once written to me stamped on the first page. Write the things they don't understand. One day the world will. One of those Saturdays, a quiet boy named Alex brought in a jar of river water, unprompted, and asked if we could help him figure out why the fish population in his stretch of the river had been dropping. He'd made crude sketches of the shoreline, cataloged visible algae growth, and noted the water temperature over several weeks. His method wasn't perfect, but his curiosity was. I saw myself in him, the way his eyes lit up when I told him his work mattered. 3 years after the will reading, the annex was no longer just a building. It was a community hub. That was when Madeline emailed me. The subject line was simple: request to visit. I thought about deleting it, but I didn't. She came on a gray Tuesday, wearing an oversized wool coat that looked borrowed. No makeup. Hair pulled into a plain bun. Her eyes darted around the reception area until they landed on the framed photograph of my grandfather, smiling in front of the marsh. She stared at it for a long time before she said anything. "He always knew who you were," she murmured. Even when I didn't. Especially then. I didn't know what to do with the lump in my throat, so I just said, "Do you want to see it?" She nodded. We walked through the greenhouse, the labs, the student project wall. She didn't touch anything, but she asked questions, real ones. How we funded it, how long trials took, if the students got to publish. When we reached the community garden out back, she stopped walking. There were two mothers kneeling in the dirt with their toddlers, laughing as they planted lettuce. Across the path, an elderly man was showing a teenager how to check soil nitrogen levels. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said finally. I stayed quiet. "I just wanted to see what he built for you, and what you've built with it." She didn't cry, but she twisted her sleeves the whole time. I let her stand there until she was ready to leave. No speeches, no rehearsed grace. Just space. She came back the next summer to volunteer with the young innovators. She had the older students practice explaining their projects without scientific jargon, helping them find the story in their data. They adored her. By the end of the program, they were calling her Coach M. One evening, after the last student presentation, she handed me a folder. "It's a communication guide," she said, almost embarrassed. "For the shy ones. Thought it might help." Inside were pages of tips, prompts, even diagrams for posture and pacing. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful. And it was hers. She never apologized with words, but she showed up, and sometimes that's more than enough. 6 years have passed since the day my parents and Madeline walked out of my grandmother's house, the door clicking shut behind them like a full stop. I haven't heard from my parents since. Sometimes I see their names in charity gala press releases or in articles about Florida real estate deals. I don't feel much when I do. The annex now spans 4 labs, 3 greenhouses, and more than 60 acres of trial plots. Our drought-resistant grain project has just been approved for large-scale testing in sub-Saharan Africa. We've formed partnerships with universities as far away as Brazil and Kenya. Last month, I stood on a stage in San Francisco to accept a national grant for climate innovation. The auditorium lights were blinding, but I didn't flinch. In my breast pocket, I carried my grandfather's pocket watch, polished brass, initials faint but visible, just as my grandmother had given it to me. Inside the lid, a tiny photograph of me at age 10, standing next to my science fair display on honeybee communication. That watch sits on my desk now, where the morning light strikes it before I begin work. Some mornings I catch myself tracing the engraved edge with my thumb, like I'm holding his hand. I don't speak out loud, but in my mind I tell him about the things we've built, the students we've sent into the world with questions they're no longer afraid to ask. Legacy, I've learned, isn't a monument, it's a map. One built from choices and small acts of courage, from the patience to plant seeds you might never see bloom. On clear nights, I walk to the far end of the annex fields, past the solar irrigation test beds and the student gardens, to the old wooden bench my grandfather built himself. From there, the stars stretch unbroken across the sky. Real ones, not the glow-in-the-dark stickers we once arranged on my bedroom ceiling. And when the wind moves just right through the trees, I swear I can hear his voice. Write the things they don't understand. One day, the world will, now, at last. It does. Winter came late that year, the kind where the air carries the smell of wood smoke and the marsh turns silver at dawn. I was at the annex before sunrise most mornings, the kind of cold that made your breath visible hanging over the workbench. There was a stillness in those hours I'd come to treasure. One particular morning, I found my grandmother already waiting in the glass-walled conference room. She was wearing her heavy cardigan, the one with the mismatched buttons, and had a stack of manila folders in front of her. "I've been going through some things," she said, patting the pile. "Your grandfather kept more records than the IRS." I smiled and sat down across from her. "That doesn't surprise me." She slid the top folder toward me. Inside were letters, some typed, some handwritten, between my grandfather and people I'd never met. A seed researcher in Arizona, a beekeeper in Maine, a high school science teacher in Alabama. Every letter mentioned sending them supplies, covering postage, even wiring small amounts of money for their projects. "He didn't just build this place for you," she said. "He was building a network long before you had the keys." I traced my fingers over the paper, feeling the slight ridges of the typewriter ink. It hit me then. This annex wasn't the beginning. It was a continuation. My role wasn't to own it. It was to keep the line unbroken. That realization shaped the next year. We expanded our partnerships beyond the obvious institutions. We started sending micro-grants to rural schools, supplying them with field kits and lending our graduate students as mentors. I traveled to places most donors had never heard of, standing in gymnasiums where ceiling tiles sagged and still hearing a roar of excitement when we unpacked a brand new microscope. In one of those schools, a weather-worn brick building in western Kentucky, I met a girl named Shelby. She wore her hair in a tight braid, spoke barely above a whisper, and asked if it was okay to do a project on clouds, because, as she put it, that's not science, really. By the end of the semester, she'd charted wind patterns, rainfall, and cloud cover, linking them to pollination rates in her county's crops. When she presented her work, she stood straighter than I'd ever seen her. It reminded me of something my grandfather used to say: "The best thing you can give someone is a reason to stand taller." That spring, Madeline came back, not for a tour this time, but for an idea. She'd been volunteering regularly, her Coach M reputation growing among the students. She wanted to start a storytelling lab within the annex, a place where kids could learn to present their findings in video, audio, and written formats. "Science needs a translator," she said. "I can do that." Part of me bristled at first. I wasn't sure if this was about her finding a role or finding a spotlight, but over the months that followed, she showed up, hauling camera gear, editing videos late into the night, sitting with students who froze in front of the lens until they laughed and tried again. She never asked for credit. One night, as we were locking up, she lingered by the doorway. "You know," she said, "I didn't just believe them because they told me things about you. I wanted to believe them. It made my life easier." She paused, eyes fixed on the dark parking lot. "I'm sorry for that." It was the closest she'd come to an apology. I nodded, letting the quiet hold it without picking it apart. The next big change came quietly, an email from a climate research foundation inviting us to present at an international conference in Copenhagen. It would mean taking our soil regeneration data, student programs, and crop trials onto a global stage. I said yes, without hesitation, but in the weeks leading up to it, I felt a weight in my chest I couldn't quite name. The night before we left, my grandmother called me into her apartment. She was sitting at her small kitchen table with a wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a worn compass. "This," she said, tapping the compass, "was your grandfather's when he was about your age. He used it on every survey trip, every hike. He said it kept him from getting lost, though I think it was more about knowing which way he wanted to go." She handed it to me. "You'll take it with you." I opened the folded paper. It was a map, not of land, but of ideas. Circles connected by lines, each labeled in my grandfather's blocky handwriting: soil, bees, water, kids, trust. At the bottom, in smaller letters: "If one fails, the rest must carry it." I carried both the map and the compass to Copenhagen. When I stood in front of a hall full of scientists, educators, and policymakers, I didn't lead with our data or our funding model. I told them about a man who believed soil could remember kindness, about the students who'd carried that belief forward, about the people who'd shown up when they had every reason not to. When the applause came, it felt different. Not like they were clapping for me, but for something we were all building together. Back home, on a clear spring evening, I walked to the far bench at the edge of the annex fields. The air smelled of new grass and tilled earth. I set the compass on the bench beside me, the needle trembling toward north, and thought about the map in my desk drawer. The work ahead was vast, maybe endless. But for the first time, it didn't feel like I was carrying it alone. And as the wind moved through the trees, I could almost hear him again. Find your direction. Then leave markers for the next one who comes looking. Summer settled over the annex in a haze of heat and green. The greenhouses thrummed with life, rows of drought-resistant maize nearly shoulder-high, tomato vines thick with fruit, bees moving lazily among the flowering herbs in the pollinator beds. One Friday evening, after the students had gone and the last of the staff had shut down the labs, I wandered into the main hall. The place was quiet except for the hum of the refrigeration units and the faint creak of the old beams cooling in the night air. On the central table lay a stack of new notebooks for the fall session of Young Innovators, the covers still smelling faintly of fresh ink and cardboard. I opened one and ran my thumb over the first page. Write the things they don't understand. One day the world will. I could see my grandfather's hand in those words, even though they were now typeset. The front door opened, letting in a rush of warm air. It was Madeline. She carried a box labeled Story Lab Equipment, handle with care. I thought you'd gone home, I said. I forgot these, she replied, setting the box on a workbench. The kids want to record their presentations outside next week, and I found some portable mics we can use. She hesitated, looking around the empty hall. It's strange, you know, how this place feels. Steady, like it's been here 100 years. I knew what she meant. That's the idea. She gave a short laugh, almost self-conscious, then said, I used to think legacy was about having your name on something. Now I think it's about whether the thing keeps going when you're not in the room. I didn't answer right away. But in that moment, I realized something had shifted between us. We were no longer fighting for space. We were holding it, together. Later that night, after she'd gone, I walked out to the bench at the far end of the fields. The air was thick with the scent of clover and freshly turned soil. In the distance, the lights from the annex glowed soft and steady against the dark. I thought of the compass my grandmother had given me, of the map with its 5 words: soil, bees, water, kids, trust. Each one a point to steer by. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I snapped a photo of the annex under the stars and sent it to her with a simple message. Still here. A minute later, her reply lit the screen. Me too. I set the phone down and leaned back, letting the night fill my lungs. The work was far from over. There would be more seasons, more storms, more students with questions that might take years to answer. But I understood now that the best part of the legacy my grandfather left me wasn't the building, or the patents, or even the map. It was the people who chose to keep showing up. And as long as we did, the annex would never lose its way. By early autumn, the annex was humming again. The young innovators had returned from summer break, bringing with them half-finished projects and new ambitions. One group wanted to design a low-cost water filtration system using only locally available materials. Another was determined to track the migration of monarch butterflies through our region. The Story Lab, Madeline's domain, had become the beating heart of the program. Even the shyest students gravitated there, coaxed into speaking by the low hum of recording equipment and her knack for asking the right questions. I would pass by and hear her saying, "Start with why you cared enough to try, The data will follow. One crisp Saturday, a parent stopped me outside the greenhouse. He was a tall man with work-roughened hands, his son trailing behind him clutching a spiral notebook. "I just wanted to thank you," the man said. "My boy used to think science was for other people. Now he wakes up before dawn to check his plant samples." His voice caught, and he cleared his throat. "You gave him something I couldn't." I thought of my grandfather, of all the times he'd given me space to be curious without asking for proof it was worth it. "He gave himself that," I said. We just held the door open. That night, I stayed late after everyone had gone, reviewing grant proposals in the quiet. The annex felt different after dark, more like a watchtower than a workplace. Through the tall windows, the fields stretched out silver under the moonlight, the rows of experimental crops casting faint shadows. I reached into my desk and took out the compass my grandmother had given me. The brass was warm from my hand, the needle twitching toward its true north. I set it next to the pocket watch on the blotter, their metal catching the lamplight. 2 different tools, 2 different times, but both meant to keep you from losing your way. In the stillness, I thought about the map my grandfather had drawn: soil, bees, water, kids, trust. We'd built programs around each one, not because the words were magic, but because they forced us to ask the right questions. Were we tending the soil, not just using it? Were we protecting the pollinators? Was the water cleaner than when we found it? Were the kids leaving with more than they came with? Were we worthy of the trust people had placed in us? I didn't have all the answers. Maybe I never would. But I realized that the value was in asking them, over and over. As the seasons turned, a soft wind rattled the greenhouse panes. Somewhere in the dark, a barn owl called, low and steady. I closed the last grant file, turned off the lamp, and stood for a moment in the shadowed office. The annex would be here in the morning. So would I. And that, I thought as I locked the door, was how you knew you were exactly where you were meant to be. November brought the first frost, crisping the edges of the fields and turning the marsh grass a pale gold. The students arrived in coats and scarves, their breath puffing white in the morning air as they hurried inside. The annex smelled faintly of cinnamon from the thermos of tea my grandmother had sent over for morale. That week, we hosted our first open house for the local community. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a few parents, a couple of curious neighbors. Instead, the parking lot filled before noon. Farmers, shop owners, school board members, and retirees wandered through the labs, asking questions and listening to the students explain their projects. In the story lab, Madeline had set up a live demonstration, students presenting their findings on camera, then playing back the footage so visitors could see the transformation from nervous to confident. One older woman dabbed at her eyes after watching a shy boy from her street beam at the camera. "I've never heard him speak more than 2 words," she whispered to me. By late afternoon, the sun slanted low through the greenhouse glass, catching the dust motes in a soft glow. I stood near the entrance, watching the crowd thin, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. This wasn't just my grandfather's vision anymore. It belonged to all of us. After the last guest left, Madeline and I walked the perimeter of the fields. The frost crunched under our boots, and the air was sharp with the scent of pine from the windbreak at the property line. "You know," she said, hands in her pockets, "I used to think you were just lucky. Like Grandpa favored you and that was it. But it's more than that, isn't it?" I glanced at her. It was never about luck. It was about being trusted with something and not letting it die. She nodded slowly. "I get that now." We stopped at the old wooden bench. The sky was streaked with pink and lavender, the first stars pricking through. I sat, running my fingers along the worn grain of the seat. "When he built this," I said, "he probably imagined sitting here with us, talking about the next planting season, the next project." I like to think he still does. In a way. Madeline didn't answer right away. She sat beside me, staring at the horizon. "Maybe that's what legacy really is," she said at last. "Sitting in a place someone made for you, and making sure it's still worth sitting in." The wind shifted, carrying the faint, briny smell of the marsh. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. Somewhere inside, I felt the map's 5 words settle into place again. Soil, bees, water, kids, trust. Each one a promise, each one a direction. When I opened my eyes, the annex lights were glowing in the distance, steady against the coming dark. And I knew, with the same certainty the compass needle always found north, that we were still on course. December arrived with rain that seemed to soak straight through the bones. The fields lay dormant under a thin veil of mist, and the greenhouses became warm havens where the scent of damp earth mingled with rosemary and basil from the herb beds. Inside the annex, we shifted into winter projects, data analysis, equipment maintenance, and planning for spring trials. The young innovators met in smaller groups, huddled over laptops or sketching ideas for the next planting cycle. Madeline's Story Lab stayed busy, editing video recaps of the students' work to send to donors and partner schools. One evening, as I was reviewing soil moisture reports in my office, my grandmother appeared in the doorway. She had her coat draped over her shoulders and held a small tin in her hands. "Cookies," she said, setting the tin on my desk. "The kind your grandfather liked. Molasses and ginger." I smiled. "Bribery?" "Motivation," she corrected. Then, more softly, "He'd be proud of this place, Clara. Of you." Her words warmed me more than the tea cooling beside my elbow. "I hope so." She looked around the office, eyes lingering on the compass and the pocket watch sitting side by side. "You know, he kept that compass in his pocket even when we went to town for groceries. Said you never know when you'll need to know your way." After she left, I sat for a while without touching the cookies, just listening to the hum of the building settling into its nighttime rhythm. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, tapping gently against the window. Later that week, a letter arrived. Postmarked from a rural school district in Montana we'd sent field kits to earlier in the year. Inside were thank you notes from the students, each written in colored marker, some decorated with tiny drawings of plants or bees. One note caught my eye. "Thank you for helping us see things we never noticed before." I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. That Friday, I stayed late to close up. Walking through the dim hallways, I paused at the main entrance, where the glass doors reflected the glow of the interior lights. Beyond them, the fields disappeared into the fog. I thought about how easy it would be to let a place like this fade if no one cared enough to keep it alive. But I also thought about everyone who did care. Students, volunteers, Madeline, my grandmother, and realized the annex had roots now. Not just in the soil, but in people, locking the door. I stepped out into the mist, the air cool and clean. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way to the car. And in the quiet, I heard my grandfather's voice in memory, calm, certain, unhurried. "Keep going. You're heading the right way." January broke with a brittle cold, the kind that makes the air sting your lungs. The annex roofs glittered with frost each morning, and the marsh behind the property lay still and glassy. Inside, the greenhouses were a contrast of life, rows of winter greens thriving under grow lights, the faint hum of heaters keeping the chill at bay. We used the slower season to bring everyone together for planning sessions. One afternoon, I gathered the staff, volunteers, and a few of our oldest young innovators in the conference room. The whiteboard quickly filled with goals. Expand the community garden, develop a beekeeping module, host a regional student science fair. When it was Madeline's turn, she stood at the end of the table with her hands in her pockets. "I think we should start recording oral histories," she said. "Not just the science, but the people. Farmers, teachers, even the kids. Why they care. Why it matters." There was a murmur of interest around the table. I caught her eye and nodded. "Let's do it." Over the next weeks, I'd often find her in a quiet corner of the annex, camera rolling as she listened to someone talk about the first time they planted a seed or the day they realized the river near their home had changed. She was collecting more than stories. She was preserving the heartbeat of the place. One evening, after everyone had left, I wandered into the story lab. On her desk was an open notebook, and on the page she'd scrawled 5 familiar words: soil, bees, water, kids, trust. It stopped me for a moment. Those words had come from my grandfather's map, but seeing them in her handwriting felt different, like they'd crossed a bridge from one generation to the next, from one sibling to another. That night, I walked out to the bench at the far edge of the property. The sky was moonless, the stars sharp and cold above me. I pulled the compass from my pocket and set it on the bench, watching the needle tremble and settle. I thought about the path that had brought me here, the will reading, the letter, the fights and silences, the years of building brick by brick. None of it had been simple. None of it had been clean. But every turn, every stubborn refusal to let go, had led to this, a place that was more than mine. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. When I opened them, I picked up the compass and slipped it back into my coat. The annex lights glowed faintly in the distance, steady against the dark. I started back toward them, my boots crunching in the frost, certain of only one thing. There was still work to do, and I was exactly where I was meant to be to do it. By February, the annex had become a second home to more people than I could have imagined. Students dropped by after school just to check on the greenhouse beds. Retirees from town volunteered to repair fencing or paint signs. Even the postman lingered some mornings to chat over coffee in the break room. One Saturday, we hosted a winter workshop on soil health. The conference room was full, farmers in worn coats, high school science teachers, a handful of parents curious about starting gardens. I watched from the back as one of our oldest young innovators, a boy named Eli, stood up to present. His voice trembled at first, but when he started explaining how microbes enrich the soil, his face lit up. By the time he finished, the room was nodding along like they'd been let in on a secret. Afterward, Eli found me in the hallway. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, holding a stack of his handouts. "I want to do this again. Maybe for the elementary kids next time?" I smiled. "We'll make it happen." Later that day, I found Madeline in the story lab, reviewing footage from the workshop. On the screen, Eli's hands moved animatedly as he spoke, his excitement almost leaping out of the frame. "You were right," I told her. "The stories matter." She didn't look up from the monitor, but I saw the corner of her mouth lift. They always have. As the month drew to a close, I stood once again on the bench at the edge of the property. The fields were still bare, but the days were lengthening, and the first faint green shoots of cover crops pushed through the soil. The air was damp and cold, but it carried the scent of change, of something waking. I thought of my grandfather then, and of the day I'd opened that envelope in the lawyer's office. How small I'd felt in that moment, and how vast this place felt now. The compass was in my pocket, warm from my hand. The needle pointed true. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I didn't just belong here because it was given to me. I belonged because I had chosen to stay. March came in with rain and wind, drumming against the greenhouse roofs and sending ripples across the marsh. The annex buzzed with the kind of energy that comes when spring feels close but hasn't quite arrived. Seed trays lined every available surface, labels written in careful black marker. The smell of damp soil clung to the air. We launched the oral history project in earnest that month. Madeline set up a small recording corner in the main hall, a plain backdrop, 2 chairs, and a camera. People stopped by between tasks to share memories. The first harvest they'd ever brought in, the moment they decided to fight for cleaner water. The teacher who'd changed their life. One afternoon, my grandmother agreed to sit for an interview. She wore her Sunday sweater, the one with pearl buttons, and kept smoothing the collar as the camera light blinked on. When he bought this land, she began, people thought he'd lost his mind. Too much marsh, too much work, no profit in it. But he said, profit isn't the point. Roots are. She glanced toward me then, and for a moment her eyes softened. Clara's got those roots now. Stronger than mine. Maybe stronger than his. After the recording, she stayed a while, sipping tea in the break room. You know, she said, your grandfather once told me that trust is the only crop worth tending year after year. Everything else depends on it. That night, I stayed late again, reviewing the day's footage, hearing her words alongside those of the students and volunteers. I saw the annex differently, not just as a project or responsibility, but as a living thing, shaped by everyone who touched it. Near the end of the month, we held our first spring planning dinner. The long table in the conference room was covered in mismatched dishes, stews, fresh bread, pies still warm from the oven. Laughter and conversation wove through the air, and every so often, someone would tap a glass to share an idea or a memory. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the head of the table, the compass in my pocket like a steady weight. This place was built on 5 words, I said, writing them on the whiteboard: soil, bees, water, kids, trust. They're more than a map. They're a promise. And it's not mine alone to keep. It's ours. For a heartbeat. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping, and the sound spread, filling the space until it felt almost like the walls themselves were joining in. Looking around at the faces, some I'd known all my life, others who'd only just found their way here, I felt the quiet certainty of belonging settle over me again. The storm outside had eased, but the wind still rattled the windows. Inside, though, the air was warm, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. April arrived with a stretch of unseasonably warm days. The annex fields turned from brown to pale green almost overnight, and the marsh came alive with the calls of returning birds. We were days away from our first big spring open house, a chance to show donors, local officials, and the community what we'd built together. That morning, a black SUV rolled into the gravel lot. My parents stepped out, dressed as though they were attending a board meeting, not a farm. Madeline froze mid-step, her camera dangling at her side. "We're here to see what you've been doing," my mother said, her eyes sweeping over the main building. "And to talk about the land's future." I led them into the conference room, where the walls were lined with photos from the oral history project. Eli holding a jar of rich soil, my grandmother smiling at the camera, kids in boots and gloves planting saplings, the room filled with volunteers, students, and neighbors, all curious about the unannounced visitors. My father cleared his throat. You could expand this place, Clara, sell part of the marsh, bring in developers. It would be profitable. The word hung in the air like a stone. I reached into my pocket and set my grandfather's compass on the table. The needle trembled, then settled. Profit isn't the point, I said, my voice steady. Roots are, and these people, this place, are the roots. A ripple moved through the room. Madeline stepped forward, lifting her camera. You should hear what they've built here, she told our parents. It's bigger than money. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Eli's small voice broke the silence. If you sell it, we can't grow the flowers for the bees anymore. Something in my mother's face shifted. Not a smile, but not the usual guarded mask either. She looked at the photos again, then at the compass. My father said nothing. They left without another word. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the marsh, I walked the edge of the property. The open house was days away, but the annex already hummed with preparation, rows weeded, signs painted, stories ready to be told. I stood on the old bench, the compass warm in my palm, and realized the truth. This land, this mission, no longer needed my family's approval to have worth. I chose to stay. I chose to build. And I chose to protect it, because trust, once planted, can outlast even the deepest wounds. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth, and I knew spring had truly begun.